Good morning, everyone. I am Melissa Yuen, Curator at the Syracuse University Art Museum, and I am here to welcome you all and to introduce Monumental Concerns, a year-long initiative led by Carrie Weems, Syracuse University's artist-in-residence. Before we begin today's program, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. Today's program would not be possible without the Office of the Chancellor's support of the university's Artist-in-Residence program, along with contributions from Social Studies 101 and the Syracuse University Art Museum. The planning for the event was led by Miranda Trout, Assistant Provost for Arts and Community Programming, and her colleagues in the Office of Strategic Initiatives, Associate Provost Marcel Haddix, and Department Administrator Luciana Justin. I would also like to acknowledge my museum colleagues, Carrie's studio team, and colleagues in Lightwork and the university's major events team for their work in realizing today's event. Finally, I would like to thank all of our speakers for gathering here today. I look forward to hearing from each of you, share your thoughts and expertise in what will prove to be a day of thoughtful, nuanced, and productive conversation. Monumental Concerns considers the role monuments play in contemporary society and imagines what a monument could look like in 21st century America. Part one of this project, today's symposium, we will begin with national and local conversations around monuments. Questions we will consider include, how do we dialogue about these often controversial issues and fairly address a multitude of perspectives? To what extent do we invite opposition to discussions of monument removal or displacement? When and how do these debates spill over into racial violence, and what can we do to address this reality? How do we acknowledge the emotional and nationalistic role that monuments often play while advocating for a more inclusive historical framing? These questions are primarily driven by recent events, most notably the summer 2020 protests catalyzed by the murder of George Floyd. The results of these events are a reckoning of the histories told by monuments, despite the objections voiced by groups who advocate for retaining of these complicated symbols. These varied reactions to contested monuments are all highly personal, with many individuals drawing on their lived experiences, family histories, cultural heritage, or the potency of nostalgia for a lost past to inform their responses. The polarization and tension around monuments create a pressure that makes productive dialogue difficult. As such, these works provide opportunity for us to begin building a framework for conversation about these monumental concerns, which has roots in our current moment of reckoning related to representational politics and shifting demographics in the United States. These very tensions are at play here in the city of Syracuse with the Columbus Monument downtown. Closer to our present location on the campus of Syracuse University, we see complicated histories around campus. Some examples include Jean-Antoine Houdon's George Washington in Maxwell Hall, James Earl Frazier's seated Abraham Lincoln outside the same building, or Louise Caish's Saltine Warrior on the quad outside the Carnegie Library. In the university's art museum where I work, we hold the contents of James Earl Frazier and Laura Garden Frazier studios, which include the only known surviving plaster model for Frazier's Roosevelt Monument that was recently removed from its plinth outside the American Natural History Museum in New York City, and plaster casts from Garden Frazier's Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson Monument that was in Baltimore. As someone who works with these materials, I am especially interested in learning about the way forward. What are the frameworks that we can use to further conversation and to work through cultural polarization? These are the questions we will tackle in part two of Monumental Concerns, which is scheduled for spring of 2024, so please stay tuned for that. But before we can look ahead to the spring, we have today's symposium. Our morning session will feature 6 speakers. You can find their bios and the rest of today's speakers' bios in today's program. This morning we'll begin, and we will hear from Carrie Weems, followed by Julie Ehrlich from the Mellon Foundation, Paul Farber from Monuments Lab, artists Marissa Williamson and Brandon Lazor, and finally Timur Hammond, assistant professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment here at Syracuse University. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to share their ideas, followed by roughly 10 minutes for questions from the audience, depending on the 20-minute time limit. We will then break for lunch after the Q&A session that follows Timur's paper. For each of our speakers, please approach the podium when you see your name appear on the screen. And now that we know how our morning will unfold, I am delighted to turn the stage over to Carrie Mae Weems.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. It's really wonderful to see you all. Thank you all for joining us on this rainy morning. When I saw it raining, I thought, oh, well, this is good. So we can all sort of hunker down together. A few years ago, I was working on a project called Grace Notes. It was made as a commemoration for the Emmanuel Nine, those people who had lost their lives at the hands of a young man, outraged and locked in notions of his own supremacy, his own ability to destroy lives. And working on that project, I was really struggling with the meaning of grace. The piece is called Grace Notes, as I'm struggling now with the meaning of monuments and monumental concerns. And part of what happens for me, Susie Laurie Parks is in the audience today, the great playwright. We're so happy to have her here, along with her mother, who anchored Hendricks Chapel for so many years. Just so happy to have you here. So, you know, I'm working. I had this dream one night, horrible dream. And I dreamt that I was by the seashore. I dreamt that I was standing by the seashore, and this enormous tsunami was coming. This huge, massive thing that seemed that it was going to destroy the world. And I started running toward all of my friends, my family, my associates, telling them that this horrible thing was coming and to prepare for the coming of that day. And as I ran towards my friends, I looked to the right in my dream, and I saw Trump glaring at me. And I thought, what is he doing in my dream? And I remember waking up, running out onto my balcony that August night, just weeping, thinking about what was about to be unleashed in this country and how to deal with notions of grace. We're going to see a short video of what Trump has brought to us.
More than 150 years after the Civil War, monuments, schools, and roads across the country still honor Confederate generals and leaders. But in the midst of the recent protests demanding racial equality, there's a renewed push to take down the monuments.
just hate seeing history destroyed.
You were traitors, you attempted to secede from the Union, then had the audacity to lose, and then put up monuments of your loss? That feels like a great lie, and racism is what has allowed it to be a lie.
I'm one of you! Our streets! Whose streets? Our streets!
Here is a symbol that I can connect to my homeland. And we will do anything to prove to people that we can stand and love your country, even though we have been bitterly treated.
I want the monument to stay. I want to teach my children about it. I want to teach my grandchildren about it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's where it needs to stay forever.
I do understand that other races do not understand how we feel about this statue, right? This is the equivalent to having Hitler's statue in a Jewish community. This part of Portsmouth is predominantly black. Why do we have to come down here and see this?
We want it to stay. We understand that most of us can only be here for a day, but it's a symbolic gesture of standing up for what we believe in.
3 a.m. I think it was, and took them down.
That I'm alive to see it come down and to see black people take it down. Do you understand? Not the city, not your mayor, not nobody important, not the people that put it up. Black people are taking down this hate. Do you understand? Taking it down.
If you want to have a citizens meeting, here it is right now. They are sick of it. We are tired of it. It's time for it to come down. And if you won't do it, the citizens are saying they'll do it.
I don't think it's a shrine. I think it's just a sign of respect. It's got all the battles on the bottom of the monument. Both wins, losses, but I mean, it's important part of history.
I have to say that I'm extremely disappointed in our representation of the American Italian community
of our power level. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Extremely disappointed.
If they tear down this statue, I can check my rational thoughts better than I can my emotional thoughts.
About the ethnic cleansing of America and the destruction of the American way of life and a new Bolshevik-style society with no freedom of speech in this country. That's really about the ethnic cleansing of going in America.
Pay attention to history. It repeats itself. So we need to learn from these monuments and learn from, past mistakes.
With their armed militant left-wing radicals. So they had to turn to the state.
We look at Columbus as a scapegoat so that the notion to topple them does away with the sins of our history. No, it does not. Sins of our history. No, it does not. It does not. No, it does not.
I realized that in 1984 or so, I had the good fortune of attending a graduate ceremony, San Francisco State, 1984, 1983, 84. It was there that I heard the president of Bank of America speak at commencement. And he said something that really struck with me, that stuck with me, that sometime in the 2020s, that America would become a majority-minority country. I started thinking about this, working around this immediately, right? That's how long ago I've been really thinking about this issue, about what it would mean actually for this country to become a majority-minority country. And his question to the audience was, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to respond to this change? Well, in part, we know what that response now really is, because ultimately, the real question here in the United States really is not really, what monuments we're going to put up, but rather, how are we going to negotiate this shift in power as the United States becomes a majority-minority country, moving from black right? From white to black and varying shades of brown. That is where we are. That is the only thing that really matters. Who is going to hold power? Who is going to hold sway as this country undergoes one of the greatest shifts that it could possibly imagine? I remember seeing Sarah Palin walk out on the stage for the first time, and I knew that something was really wrong. So I've been thinking about this for quite some time, and thinking about when and where I enter. How do I negotiate this debate? How do I negotiate these discussions? I know that the history of violence has held sway, that the history of violence in one way or another brings us actually to this moment, to this hour, to this day, in this room, on this Saturday, talking about this thing, about monuments, about contested sites of memory, about contested sites of memory, and about contested sites of memory, how to play that out across a dynamic field of ideas, of thinkers, of practices, of investigation, of negotiation, navigation, is really the question that ultimately is at hand. So that we here with broken treaties and broken dreams and broken lives and broken families and broken promises and broken tribes and broken languages and broken promises, acknowledging native land without doing much else beyond that acknowledgement, right? So we see Columbus everywhere. We meet at Columbus Circle, near Columbus Circle, around Columbus Circle, right, at the pinnacle of cities, a tribute to a tyrant. How do we unpack this idea? What do we do with these contested sites of memory? So that we know that essentially day by day that the country is slowly, persistently changing, that traditions are dying and forces are colliding, and demographics shifting from white to black in varying shades of brown. The evidence along with the anger is everywhere, the resistance so strong you could taste it. Tongues were wagging, fingers were pointing from here, there, and everywhere, blaming you, blaming them, blaming us, and forces tripped up by forces beyond their control, where white men were disenfranchised and disaffected, and black men were disaffected and dying, and yet ultimately both are devoid of real power, and yet blinded by rage, race, and historical circumstance. We were all blaming the other. There were wars and rumors of wars, and ISIS has been growing, and the West is trembling in the face of its own created monster. All trust seems to be broken. And now we stand in the autumn of the patriarch. Corruption is rampant and crime is everywhere, with bubbles bursting, companies closing, banks failing, capital collapsing, murder everywhere, mayhem, riots, revolutions and revolts, assassins and sociopaths everywhere, taking matters into their own hands, ruling the streets and government alike, knowing that by 2020, manifest destiny would be boxed up and put away, and yet compelled by a growing sense of loss, Confederates and conservatives are coming out of the attic, despising Obama in this case, and voting for Trump. I've been looking at monuments for a very long time. I started looking at monuments initially when I was living in Paris in search of Sarah Baartman, trying to understand what could have possibly happened to this woman. I've followed that line for a very long time. I've looked at various kinds of monuments in various kinds of places, what they do, how they function. Whether in Brittany or in the south of France or in Portugal and other places as well. I started standing in front of monuments long ago, I'm reminded, of course, of Douglass and his resistance very, very, very early on to the notion of Confederate monuments, demanding even then that they be taken down, a long, long history of protest. And how are we to account for all of those who came here against their will, against their own urging, but at the urging of another force and another kind of body? How do we reckon with this? How do we negotiate this? How do we trouble this? How do we unpack it literally? The role of the Confederacy, the role of the Confederate daughters themselves, I think a great deal can actually be learned from them. And perhaps we'll be able to talk about their role later. But of course, they were the initiators. The Confederate daughters were the ones, the united daughters of the Confederacy were really the ones that made sure that there were massive monuments all around the nation. Amazing work, incredible campaign, extraordinary fundraising. Right? You know, even as we contest them, how do we honor that dead? How do we honor the side of those people who lost their loved ones, whether we agree or disagree with who they are? How do we honor the dead? Through our own humanity, how do we practice that? I'm going to just say just a couple of more things, because I think for me, in a lot of ways, this is more of a musing rather than a talk, but a musing. You know, that I wonder about what structures, what containers, what instrument, what form, what granite or marble or bronze, what towering obelisk or marker could ever really possibly hold the complexity of one's life, of one's spirit, of one's meaning? What's the function of monuments? Do we need them? Is there another way of thinking about the monument, right? A monument can be many things. A monument can be a tree, it could be a valley, it could be a stone, it can be a brick. It could be a grave, it could be a stream, it could be a mountain. Right? A monument can be any number of things, and yet for some reason we persist in thinking that somehow the monument has to glorify the individual, the personification of the individual, and therefore of greatness. And I think that in some ways, I think that artists are calling this into question, which is one of the reasons that I invited the artists that we've invited today, that there are other ways of thinking about monuments, and there are other ways of thinking about monuments as we grow into the vastness of ourselves and the vastness of our humanity. Right? That the spirit is something else, and the spirit holds us differently. That the monument essentially, and I'm hoping that we might even be able to address this today, what is the monument actually? What does it mean to be a monument? I keep thinking in some small way that it's really a vessel. It's a vessel and a container that can carry and hold a certain kind of meaning, a certain kind of complexity. But I don't know, again, if any sort of marble will allow for the deepest expression of who and what we are. And as we evolve towards ourselves in this sort of ever-changing world, right, in this ever-changing world, every generation will come up with new ideas about what needs to be put in place, what needs to be put in play, what needs to represent us in the deepest possible way. Every generation will do that. Every monument will always be called into question, particularly monuments that seem to glorify the individual, rightly or wrongly, right? There may be new ways, as Idris is working on, new ways of presenting notions about how to deal with public space, how to negotiate public space beyond the great monuments that we've seen before, right? In certain kind of cultures, and I don't know, maybe we'll get a chance to see this before my time is up, you know, there are, in the Yoruba tradition, individuals are always shown, the individual. Right? Yomaya might be shown. Ogun might be shown. But when you get to the highest level of high, the greatest level of high, there is no personification. It is only a piece of cloth floating high above. It's just a thing, right? as a sort of carrier, and I work with it all the time. I look at it all the time in my home. I work with it as an idea constantly. And I'm also looking towards other artists for the ways in which other artists have thought about monuments. Of course, Paul Farber is here, the great material that you've done in Monuments Lab, the work with Karen Olivier, I think is spectacular. Very, very interesting work, right? But I do know that there are no frozen men on horseback that are going to lead me very far. They're not going to take me anywhere. You know, as much as I might admire the great craftsmanship, they're not taking me anywhere. And so I keep coming back to that. What happens then when we displace? What is the role of that displacement? Who is deciding? Who will make these kinds of decisions? Who will be at the table? Why will they be at the table? What knowledge do they have to be at the table? What are our tools that we offer to those who are saying that we need to work somehow differently across conflict and across territory and across our differences? That's something that I'm really hoping that we'll be able to talk more about in part 2 when we reconvene in the spring with a larger roundtable of thinkers really kind of unpacking these ideas about how we actually resolve these very, very difficult questions around what we will be. And in a lot of ways, I don't think that we are really going to be able to answer that question for a while, but I do believe that there is certainly the impetus and the desire to do so, to begin to grapple with the complexity of these questions. How might we learn from Europe? Europe is doing amazing things around sort of contested sites of memory. Very, very important work is going on there. Very important work is going on in South America. A number of people are beginning to convene, understanding that we could no longer work if we are hoping to solve the problem, to address the problem in real measure, that we can't do it in our individual silos, that it can't be, monumental concerns just at Syracuse University, but it has to actually be put in context with a number of different organizations and entities and stakeholders that are trying to figure out the dynamics of the problem and the real questions to be asked, Because when we talk about social justice, when we talk about restorative justice, what are we really talking about? What are we really talking about? And I keep going back to this idea of what we're really getting at. And what are the issues that we need to explore? And I thought that one of the reasons it would be so important to bring Paul and Julie and so many of you here today was because of the deep work that you've been doing in this area for so many years. The work that Hamza is going to be doing, or is doing in LA, I think is absolutely critical and really important. That exhibition, along with the writers that you are bringing in concert with one another, I think is really remarkable. But I do think, and I wanted to show you very quickly, before I finish, just a few, of course there are monuments to our fallen, to our people, to communities, and I love the way in which communities set up markers. But I've also been looking very much at people like Saul Lewitt and Hans Hake, and the way in which they establish monuments in Europe, the sort of anti-monument. And I just wanted to look at them very quickly before I let you go, as I ask again, just a couple of questions here. We are an evolving people, ever-changing, and every generation will have its own ideas about what best represents it. And I suppose I do have actually more questions and more answers or more questions and answers. But I am interested in looking at the ways in which others have really dealt with this past. I am interested in notions of perspective. I am interested in how we account for those who arrived against their will. I am interested in finding out how to negotiate those that were here long before Columbus discovered America. I am interested in how we honor the dead on both sides, how we commemorate the loss. For regardless of how we stand in opposition to certain kinds of ideas or for certain ideas. I am interested in understanding what the tools are for navigating this difficult terrain, how we can resolve these conflicts around contested sites of memory. How do we do that? What are the tools? What can we learn from other nations and other countries? How they've negotiated these differences, how they've negotiated in Berlin, for instance, I think is fascinating. How they've used parks in Bulgaria, I think is extraordinary. So there are all these spaces, I think, that we can look in order to sort of answer and begin to answer some of these questions about what monuments are, what we do with them, how we might consider them, how they might be useful for us. And I am very much looking forward to all of your presentations today, and I thank you so much for joining me.